Okay. Well, we're sorry we're late. I had to get a different room because the room we were in was too small and beneath their dignity. So we're now actually in the Director General's meeting room, and we'll get started shortly. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. Julian. There you go.
All right, so I'm Julian Gass, and I am working on optimizing jet finding within the ATLAS trigger system. So jets are collimated streams of hadrons that form from isolated gluons or quarks that could be the result of proton-proton collisions in the ATLAS detector. So it is important to find these jets because they can be signatures of standard model processes or new physics scenarios. So yes, so specifically I'm looking at the anti-KT jet finding algorithm, which is desired because it is the most popular jet finding algorithm used in offline analyses. And you can kind of see from this picture why. Right here is the anti-KT algorithm, and you can see it gives really nice circular shapes for the jets, and it prioritizes jets with higher energy than others, as opposed to other jet finding algorithms where they're kind of all over the place or too constrained. So it's a goal for the ATLAS collaboration to put the anti-KT algorithm in the low-level trigger of the ATLAS detector, specifically for the phase 2 upgrade of the trigger data and acquisition system for ATLAS. So the goal is to be able to perform anti-KT jet reconstruction within 2.5 microseconds of latency, which is kind of a difficult goal, as I'll explain here. So this time I'm going to go more in depth into the actual algorithm. It is an iterative algorithm, so it runs step by step. It has n iterations, or n is the number of particles found within the calorimeter. So what happens is at the beginning of each iteration, it either creates or updates the separation list, which is comprised of two distinct lists, one being the distance list, which is the distances between every pair of particles found in the calorimeter. And then there's the object list, which contains the inverse transverse momentum squared of each object in the calorimeter. The functions that describe them are in there. And once it has updated this separation list, it finds the minimum of the list. And if the minimum is within the object list, then it removes that object and puts it in the jet list. If it's a distance, then it merges those two objects into a new object, removing the two old ones. And then you update the distance and object lists and run again. So if you look at this long enough, you kind of start to understand how it can cluster jets, but you don't really need to know that. All you really need to know from this is that it's an intensive algorithm, and even on the most modern FPGAs, it can really only handle about 32 input constituents before it goes over the latency requirement set by the TDAC upgrade. So what this tells us is that we have to simplify this algorithm somehow. We've tried changing the process itself by trying to reduce the number of minimum searches it takes, but that turned out to just change the algorithm too much in itself, and it behaved more like one of the other algorithms that showed up on the screen. So we're trying to now instead reduce the number of constituents to get to manageable levels. So the proposed solution is to tile the data coming in from the calorimeter, which basically lowers the resolution of the amount of data that we get, which would in itself reduce the number of constituents. But then we also want to select 6 or so of these new data constituents with the most PT, with most transverse momentum, that are also separated by at least R, which is a user set parameter. And then we would run the full anti-KT algorithm within a region surrounding these local maxima. So so basically this localizes the algorithm. So rather than going over the whole calorimeter data, you're going over just a specific set where we think a jet would be. So this greatly reduces, or hopefully will greatly reduce, the number of constituents. It might be that we still have to simplify the algorithm a little bit by simplifying the way in which the momenta are merged or something like that. So far I began my analysis by looking at the samples that I'll be running later analyses on. These are di-Higgs to 4b samples in which 2 Higgs bosons are created by a collision, and each of those Higgs bosons decay into 2 bottom quarks, and those quarks produce jets. And so I wanted to create distributions of G towers, J towers, and topol clusters, which are the different types of input constituents we can get from the calorimeters. They have different points of precision to them. And I wanted to compare those to the offline jets, which are the actual true kinematics of the simulated jets that I am running over. And so we expect basically these kinematic distributions to have similar shapes as they do in the transverse momentum on the left and the phi on the right. However, it's kind of hard to see, but in the eta, you can see the blue graph kind of doesn't go down as much as the rest of the constituents. The blue is the offline jets. So that tells us that there is something wrong with the data set, which we finally found out to be the offline jets were calibrated for, so they had higher PT or they had their PT calibrated for higher eta, which the reconstructed jets did not. So I had to implement a function that would match these jets with the spatially closest jets and not ones with the highest PT, or else we'd get weird data with the leading jets being different, and it would be hard to analyze these distributions. So once I finally fixed that, I got into looking to the amount of topol clusters within the events. We prefer topol clusters to towers because they are more precise. So if possible, we'd like to run jet reconstruction on those. So in the top graph, you can see the amount of topol clusters per event on average. And as I alluded to earlier, this is just too many constituents. It's around 800 per event, which the algorithm can only handle around 32, so that's not really good. But on the bottom graph, we see topol clusters per jet has an average of around 17, with the maximum being 32. So that actually gives us a lot of hope that we might actually be able to localize this algorithm, because the amount of jets within a local area, or amount of constituents within a local area, would be hopefully well below 32, and we could cluster these jets within manageable levels. So that's what I've done so far. What I have next up to do is to find the extent of jets found, which would be comparing the distances of the center of the jet to the farthest constituent with the jet. So that would help us determine what size of the regions we should be localizing this algorithm into, and it'll give us a better idea how many constituents would be fed to the algorithm on average. And then I'll have to repeat all these analyses for different samples, which show different standard model predicted processes and new physics scenarios. That'll give us a better idea of the kind of trigger rates this kind of algorithm would give us. And finally, once we've done all that, we can set the optimal parameters for the algorithm and compare its performance to the full anti-KT algorithm to see if there are any unforeseen changes with localizing the algorithm. And there I am on the Jura Mountains right over there. Questions?
Question?
Can I take you back to the beginning?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm really going to take you all the way back to the beginning. If you could just explain what you said, what a jet is.
Yeah. Okay. So so in the Atlas detector, we'll have 2 protons come together, or bunches, but they'll collide and it'll isolate quarks and gluons. from each other. And quarks and gluons, they would be, if they're isolated, then they're highly unstable because of color charge. I don't quite know strong force stuff, but they since they're so unstable, they kind of collapse into, decay into new color stable hadrons. And so they would create this kind of cone of particles that would form from these unstable things. Hopefully Steve's grabbing a picture.
And that's what you're trying to predict.
Yeah, I'm trying to implement an algorithm that's used to find these
So
things.
these things we call these jets. It's like a stream of
And
particles.
in the center,
And in the center, you have all the tracks that came from the collision.
okay.
And then typically in this case, they've identified these as being from B quarks, but it's a whole other issue to try to identify that. But,
Thank you.
so I guess in your final talk, you can show a picture. That's good.
Yeah.
Because your final talk will be made for general public. We'll record it. But,
Yeah.
Any other questions? Turn on your microphones.
On page 3, for the object list, that's a pretty complicated formula. Could you tell me what it does physically?
Yeah, so what it's kind of like so right here is what it's defined as. It's the transverse momentum, inverse transverse momentum squared. And it's basically trying to compare that to its weighted distance to its nearest neighbor.
Okay.
And so what it's trying to determine is if object I is sufficiently isolated from other particles to be.
I see, but isn't the distance list also trying to do the same thing though? I thought that one was for isolation.
Yeah, the distance list is just so that you can determine if two particles are close enough together to be merged. The object list
Okay.
tells us if a particle is isolated and if it should be declared a jet and not merged.
Okay.
Any other questions? I was going to ask if it's more, will the data we get when we've increased the luminosity in run 3 going to be more of a challenge for this? Will there be more merged jets or more background, let's say from pileup?
Yeah, I know the reason why I'm looking at dihiggs 4b is because we expect to see those in the high luminosity LHC, and the jets in those are particularly really close to each other, and that's kind of a sub goal of our analysis, is to determine how the algorithm will behave when the jets have, in those tight situations where the jets are really close together.
Sure. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.